Shalom. I'm Reva Gamber, director of the Film Festival, and I'm very glad to welcome Matan Zamir, our guest speaker for Image of Victory. Matan is the Deputy Consul General of the Regional Pacific Northwest Consulate General of Israel. Now, you've seen the film. I've seen it. It's an excellent film, an epic saga, and by one of my favorite directors, Avi Nesher. Deals, of course, with the War of Independence. Why was the war, which started actually in late November 1947, before Israel was actually even a nation, why was it so different, or why does it remain so different from, unfortunately, all the other wars that Israelis have experienced?
So hi, Riva, thank you for hosting me. Thank you for the work that you do with the festival all year round, and especially now because it's festival season. And I also loved the movie. It's a powerful historical document that talks about the War of Independence. It takes a projector and highlights the kibbutz of Nitzanim, kibbutz Nitzanim. And I think, thank you for your question, because I think it makes sense to give a broader context of the War of Independence. And there's another name to it in Hebrew, Milchemet HaKomemiyut, from the word kiyum. Kiyum means to exist. So literally it translates into the War of Existence. Because back then in 1947, 8 and 9, the Jewish population in Israel was small, 600,000. And they were, rightfully so, concerned for the actual existence, for the survival. A lot of them came from Europe after the Shoah, after World War II, with the losing most of their families and, finding hope in building a Jewish state in the land of Israel, but fighting for their existence. And kibbutz Nitzanim is a good example for that. The war, people think of it as, the war that started when Ben-Gurion declared Israel independence, right? On May 14th of 1948. However, the war started in the UN. I mean, there were attacks in the land of Israel since the 20s and even before that. But the actual War of Independence started after November 29th, 1947, the famous partition plan, the UN vote, when the country said yes or no to building a Jewish state and an Arab state, Palestinian state in the land of Israel. And then since that declaration, the first half of the war is divided into two parts. The first half of the war until May of 48 was a type of a civil war, because it was still British mandate, but Arabs from villages, from town, and we saw it in the movies, attacked their Jewish neighbors, not just in the Negev, not just around Nitzanim, but around Jerusalem and up north in the Galilee and around Tel Aviv. There are famous attacks, maybe the most famous stories that we remember from that point in time were the motorcades that delivered food and supplies from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem that was under siege during that time. And the it was named the Black Month of March, because dozens of fighters from the Haganah, from the Etzel, from the Lehi, from those organizations that were trying to fight the British, dozens of them died in different parts of Israel. And then the second half of that war of existence was after Ben-Gurion, the famous speech at the Independence Hall in Tel Aviv when he declared a Jewish state, the state of Israel. That was no longer a civil war. That was no longer between Arab militias and the Jewish and the Jews that lived there, but it was between five armies against those 600,000 Jews that lived there. The army of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. Not a lot of people remember that, but the Iraqi army actually sent soldiers back then. And of course, the Egyptian army that we see in the movie. So I think the most unique criteria of that war was that those Jews that fought realized that they're fighting because they didn't have any other choice. They did not fight to conquer any land they fought for their lives and for their own existence.
Maybe for some people, they don't know where the kibbutz that is shown in the film and of course exists in real life is located. And it also seems the movie, when you address this, that there weren't enough soldiers to guard the kibbutz. Were more soldiers purposely put by Ben-Gurion and the military leaders around Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Haifa, and not more in the southern direction?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That actually also relates to your first question about why this war was different and why it was unique, because during that war, there wasn't really a distinction between what we know today as like the front and the civilians and the cities where, between civilians, residents, kibbutz members or city folks and soldiers, because everybody fought, women, men, we saw that, variety of ages, because you fought because you didn't have any choice. And and you're absolutely right, because during that war, the army of Jordan attacked Jerusalem and actually was able to take the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, surrendered. The Jordanian army took a hold from 48 all the way to 67 when Jerusalem was liberated. I can tell you my personal story. From my mother's side, I'm 9th generation in Jerusalem, and my family goes back to when it was just the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. And I remember speaking to my grandmother who lived there. She was very young. She was in, I think, either 19 or 20, and she had my uncle as a small baby. And she told me many times on how overnight they had to run away from the Jewish quarter because they knew that the Jordanian army is coming. And they found these abandoned homes in other parts of Jerusalem, but the East Jerusalem, and where the Jewish quarter was one of the main fronts of that war. And some parts, especially around the south, where Nitzanim is the Negev, the southern part of Israel, and up north at the Galilee, had less supply, had less soldiers, less assistance from Ben-Gurion and the leadership of the Jewish, the young Jewish state back then. And in some parts, it actually became islands, Jewish islands, surrounded by both foreign armies, and before that, Arab villages, who then we saw it in the movie, that attacked them multiple times, during that war.
Yes, and the casualty rate, I believe, from the War of Independence was higher percentage-wise than in the other wars. It was devastating and impacted almost every family, lost someone, though whenever there's a war, it impacts the whole country because people know the casualties, because Israel is such a small country. A question, are the characters representative of real life people? Mira and others, are they actually people who existed at the time, or were they fictionalized?
So let me start by agreeing with what you said at the beginning. The percentage, it's almost hard to believe, but out of 600,000 people who lived back then in Israel, 6,000 people died in that war, which is 1% of the people that lived in, think about 1% of the people that lived back then in Israel died in this one war. So this is really, crazy numbers. And it affected you're right, it affected a lot of families, but a lot of those 6,000 who died came, like we said earlier, came from Europe with no family. So they were only survivors from, a long, a big family tree, or a long line of different families all over Europe, and they came to Israel because they had no other choice, and then they found their death during the War of Independence. So both way, no matter how you look at it, it's terrible. And then to answer your question, yes, when you look at the movie, the characters are almost fictional, right? You look at them and they're larger than life, but all of them represent real people. For example, Mira, who is such a charismatic, she strong, powerful image that almost looks like, like Gal Gadot, like Wonder Woman, right? She's like the hero of her time. She existed. She was only 22. She was an athlete. She was a volunteer. She came from Tel Aviv. And actually, I wrote after seeing the movie, I was intrigued by her character and by her image and who she was. So I read a letter that she wrote to her parents in Tel Aviv, and she wrote to them at the beginning when I just joined the kibbutz. I was ashamed to put a gun, to carry a gun, because it looked like I'm bragging. It looks like it's a schwitz, it's in Yiddish, like I'm showing off. But today there's no choice. We are being attacked. Even I brought Danny, the little boy, the kid, a toy gun, so he could be like his mom. He was upset that he couldn't carry grenades on his bed like his father. So that I think this letter is an interesting way to understand who she was and who these people who lived in, like we said earlier, some of them were soldiers and some of them were kibbutz members, like citizens, but their character was very strong either way.
I know the way that Avi Nesher, the director, showed the characters, you really connect to each of them. And so, well, everyone probably has seen the film, but what happens to each character really resonates within the viewer, unlike many films about wartime efforts. Just jumping ahead, one of the people in the film, though he wasn't in the kibbutz, he was, I think, in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, Abba Kovner, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, became a very famous writer in Israel. Are there any other people in the film who are very well known in Israel or around the world for their later accomplishments? Of course, besides Ben Gurion.
Right. Abba Kovner is an interesting character. I remember talking to you about it before I seen the movie, and you gave me this insight of looking at his character and the way he's being presented. Even though we know Abba Kovner is a hero, he's one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto rebellion, Holocaust survivor. He's, like you said, he's a writer. He was a poet. He published six or more books of poetry. But the way he's portrayed in the movie, and I also did a little bit of research about him, and his position was the educational officer of the Givati battalion that oversaw the 53rd Brigade. That those soldiers that were in Nitzanim were part of the 53rd Brigade. So he oversaw their cultural and education of those soldiers. The technical term is politruk, but it's basically the officer that is in charge of culture and education for the soldiers. And he's portrayed as somebody that says, you have to sacrifice. You have to sacrifice. In war, you have to sacrifice. And I mean, coming from the Holocaust and coming especially from the Warsaw Ghetto rebellion, it's hard to judge him. However, after the whole Nitzanim battle, after this whole thing took place, 33 people died in that battle, and more than 100 were taken into captivity. Firstly, at the village Majdel, the village that was next to Nitzanim, and then later was taken to Cairo to spend, I think, about 9 months or 10 months in Egyptian prison. And because so many were caught, he wrote a letter the day after the battle saying, basically shaming them on not sacrificing their lives, not fighting all the way, and falling into captivity. And after the war, Ben Gurion appointed an investigation committee to investigate what actually happened. And then those who were captured came back as part of the ceasefires agreement and told the actual story, told the heroic, we saw it in the movie, the heroic fighting of everybody there until, until there was nothing else that could be done. other than dying. And Ben-Gurion issued, after this investigation, issued an apology to every single man and woman that was there in Nitzanim, saying that they did fight with bravery and they did sacrifice everything, and taking back the letter that Abba Kovner wrote and apologizing for that letter. That became a big deal back then in Israel. And there's another, he wasn't portrayed in the movie, but another very interesting character was, his name is Yitzhak Pundak. He was the commander of the 53rd Brigade. And he felt, terrible. That left a unhealable scar on himself, losing those soldiers and losing the Battle of Nitzanim. So he really dedicated his life to go to Nitzanim every year, talking to high school students, talking to people, telling the story of the fight and the battle that happened there, until he was 104. He died in 2017. Every year he was involved in the work that they did in Nitzanim to commemorate the place and the people that fought there. Also apologized, just like David Ben-Gurion apologized about the Abba Kovner letter. Abba Kovner never apologized, still kept his beliefs until he died.
Moving away from human characters, there's another character in the movie, the main building, the structure, and it's a pillar of the movie. Would you like to comment on it?
Yes, I saw the movie, and I saw that. I agree. One of the main characters is that building that doesn't look like a kibbutz, and doesn't look really much like a regular building in Israel. You don't see a lot of building like that. So I said I have to read a little bit about that building, which is fascinating to me. And then a fascinating story behind this building. It's called the Palace. Some people actually call it the White House, but it's very different than the White House that we know, because it's white and it was big back then in 1947 scales. It was owned by an effendi, or the wealthy landlord of the region, Arab, owned it and built it. And it actually, he had 4 wives. It's also called the house with the 4 balconies, because each wife, to prevent trouble, each wife had her own balcony. So it has different names. It's also called the well house, because there's a well that also helped the fighters back then to have clean water to drink. Different names, built by the effendi. And then one of the effendi's son went to the market one day to shop, got into a fight, and killed someone at the market in one of the nearby villages. Came back to his father and told him, listen, this happened. Our family is under risk. The father said, I am afraid of eye for an eye. I'm afraid of a revenge. So I'm going to sell this house to whoever buys it. And I'm going to run away to protect the lives of my son so nobody kills him. So then who back then in the early 40s buy properties in Israel? Of course, the JNF, Kakal, Keren Kayemet Israel. So they bought the house from the effendi, and it had fields around it, and it had a little bit of he had a few cattle. So they bought the property and turned it, at some point it was actually a laundry place in between for British soldiers. After it was a laundry place, they turned it into the center of the kibbutz, and everything we see in the movie. But if you actually look at YouTube of the actual historical battles that were there, that were shot by the Egyptian army, you see that prominent building, the palace. And today, just to finish the story, fast forward 73 years later, it's actually a school to teach kids sustainability. And to teach, it's what we call Bet Sefer Sadeh, a field school, to teach how to survive in nature, how the interaction between people and nature. It's a really beautiful place. So today, the actual kibbutz Nitzanim, after the battle, the survivors that came back, the people that came back from captivity, they built Nitzanim 2 kilometers away. that place stayed as a school. They made it into a small museum, and there's a visitor center. So people can actually go. The palace is still very up and running today. So people who visit Israel can go see the place and learn about the battle. They do like this whole thing there to talk about what happened in the War of Independence and visit the memento. There's a memorial there for to salute female fighters because of the bravery of Mira and the other female fighters that were there at that battle. So they chose that location for that. So there's a whole place there that, you know, people can visit.
Well, speaking of female pilots, it is well known that women were very much part of the struggle during the War of Independence and even before, in the years leading up to the partition agreement in the UN. Did that role for women, was it sustained in the 50s and 60s? And what is it like now? What roles can women take part in the Sahel, in the Israel Defense Forces?
So it was an uphill battle. In a way, when Israel was founded, like we said earlier, women did everything because there was no choice. But over time, the separation when the IDF and the Israeli Defense Force became more structured, you know, because during the War of Independence, other than fighting for their existence, they actually built the country of Israel. They built all the institutes and they built the IDF because before the IDF, there were the organizations, the Haganah, the Etzel, and the Lech. So the more the IDF became more structured, the more women were told, you know, you can do this, but you cannot do that. And then over the years, and especially, I think the 90s were the breakthrough where after a few decisions by our Supreme Court, it was decided that there couldn't be a separation and women can at least compete against men for positions. And the test case, or the most famous test case, was a lady under the name of Alice Miller, who wanted to be a combat pilot and was denied because women were not allowed to even compete for the position. So she appealed to the Supreme Court and won. And since then, every single position at the IDF is open for both men and women. I mean, in terms of, and there's so many combat women fighters throughout the IDF. We hosted not too long ago a brigade commander. Now she's a Brigadier General Dana Erez. She is amazing. And she, you know, she's a better fighter than most men that I know. And she's an example to young girls who don't want to have anybody stopping them or anybody telling them what they can do or what they cannot do. So now the IDF and there are mixed brigades that is doing a phenomenal work, men and women together, without any, I mean, not without any issues, but no different issues than the non-mixed brigades.
In school, changing to a different subject, do students in your schools, whether it's middle school or high school, ever take a tour of the kibbutz or any other kibbutz? I mean, years ago, I think it may be a bit less now, but Masada was a place near the Dead Sea where some units, some brigades would go when the young soldiers were finished or began their training. Are there kibbutzim which during the War of Independence showed such great heroism that they've become a symbol of perseverance and resilience?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Nitzanim is one of them. Yad Mordechai, the kibbutz that was very close to Nitzanim, had even, I think, a more deadly and difficult battle. The kibbutz was completely destroyed. Yes, and we go and we visit. When I was in school, I remember, because the kibbutzim was the front, the people that fought in the kibbutz, and not just the kibbutzim, the towns, and like I said, in Jerusalem. But my story with Nitzanim, my first, you know, I don't know if we can call it a visit, but my first time in, you know, staying in Nitzanim was when I joined the IDF. I can't believe it, but it's been a few years. I joined in February, the year 2000, when we realized that there's probably no Y2K, I remember that, and the world is not coming to an end on January 1st, 2000. I realized that I'm probably going to have to join the army because, you know, the world is still with us. So I joined. It was February 15th, 2000. I was 18 and some change, and they sent me to do my basic training in Nitzanim. It was one of the most known basic training bases in Israel. It was great because it was by the sea, and it was, you know, by the kibbutz. So if you wanted to sometimes grab something to eat when the commanders were not looking, I never did that, right? Because I was very honest. So that's where I did 3 or 4 months of basic training, and I remember learning about the battle very well. Now the movie kind of gave me flashbacks from what I learned when I was 18. But I also remember, and you know, the Israeli army is being attacked for so many reasons. But I remember that very much from day one, we learned how to operate a gun, and we learned how to do first aid, and we learned, you know, different things. But we had what they were called values days, to learn values, to learn the secrecy of life, to learn what it means to, you know, work with others as part of a team or as part of a unit, to learn when to shoot, but more importantly, when not to shoot. All these values that the IDF works by. And I actually, when I was preparing for now, I looked on YouTube videos to see what the base is today. And I found this clip from during COVID, because they were all wearing masks, like 6 months ago. They did a small 5-minute clip in Hebrew about the basic training base of Nitzanim today, what it is today. Other than the fact that they moved from tents, I was in tents, to nice kind of like houses with air conditioning, which we did not have, and it gets very hot in there. They kept valued days. So they kept the same, you know, they teach them guns and they teach them first aid and they teach them all the things, but they still, and the lady and the young 18-year-old soldier from Nitzanim said that the most important days are those value days, to teach a soldier, you know, the spirit behind what they do and the importance and the meaning and the depth behind, and not just, you know, soldiers are not robots. They operate from their hearts and they operate from their brains. And these things have to be taught and have to be, you know, given to the soldiers. So that's a big part of my memory from Nitzanim.
Anything else you want to talk about with the film, which is one, I think, of our more powerful films in our lineup? Any other thoughts or connections that you made while you saw it?
One of the most memorable scenes that I remember is the whole argument around children. Because in my mind, I looked at that scene of whether to send the children away or not to send the children away. That was something that I kept thinking about, you know, days after seeing the movie. And I thought, what's the big deal? Like, why, you know, they didn't have enough food and supply, so sending the children away makes sense. And it was hard to protect the children in Nitzanim, so that's another argument in favor of sending the children away. So what was the rationale to keep the children? And then I looked into it, and I saw that there was a strong argument during that gathering, during that assembly in the kibbutz, saying that without the kids around, then what are we fighting for? Like, what's the, you know, we talked about spirit and we talked about like our values. I would personally send the children away because I think saving their lives makes much more sense. They actually called it Operation Baby, the operation where the children were moved to the nearby kibbutz or the other town. But you know, you think of it, and I wasn't sure if it's like a dramatic thing that Avi Nesher did, but no, but that's another historical fact. And then the more I read, the more I realized that Avi Nesher, the film, kept very, very accurate, very historically correct. And I think that's when you see a movie like that, you're not wowed by the drama of it. You're wowed by how much the drama is actually accurate to what it was. And that's my feedback from the movie, that, you know, as almost like we started with that, it almost looks fictional, but it all actually happened. And I'm curious to ask you, Riva, because you see a lot of movies. What is your take from the movie?
I was so drawn into the story and the connection. It also deals with the Egyptian soldiers and the journalist. And I think it's one of Avi Nesh's best films. I also recommend people seeing The Matchmaker, another of his good films. But this is, in a way, it's a more old-time saga historical movie, which are not made that much in Israel. Israel tends to do very personal stories in a small landscape. Here you have the landscape is much larger. You have Egyptian soldiers, you have the kibbutz, but on the other hand, it's intimate because he connects you to the characters, and much more than in the movie Exodus, which is also an epic saga, but hasn't really withstood the period of time as much. I think he did a great job of very moving film. And I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts on it. I do want to promote some other Israeli films we're showing later in the week. And as everyone knows, or hopefully you can see the films over several days, and you don't have to, if the film starts streaming on Thursday, see it on Thursday, you could see it for another 5 to 7 days. And starting on Monday, we have a wonderful documentary, Grossman, about the world famous author, David Grossman. We also have a speaker with it, Dr. Vered Weiss. Then we have a very strong drama, More Than I Deserve, which is in Hebrew and Russian, because one of the main characters is a young Russian woman who comes to Israel from the Ukraine, actually, in the news these days, with her son, and her life struggling to make a living, very brilliantly acted. We also have Greener Pastures, for those who like comedies, about a man who is living in a retirement home. He's lost all his money, and he decides, I guess I can say this, it's legal, to sell marijuana, taking the medical marijuana from some of the people in the retirement home who don't want it and selling it to people who do want it. And it's called Greener Pastures. And on Thursday, a wonderful documentary also, With No Land, about the story of Operation Solomon in May 1991, when nearly 15,000 Jews from Ethiopia were airlifted over a very short period of time, almost a miracle, 36 hours, with Israeli planes, big, gigantic Boeing jets and smaller planes taking off almost wing to wing, trying to rescue as many during this very difficult political time in Ethiopia. And we have an emissary from Israel, Yonatan Eav, who is now at Stanford University and came to Israel at 6 years of age. We'll talk about his own personal story. So Matan, Toda Rabah, thank you again. You made the film even more personal. And everyone who has seen it, tell your friends to get a ticket or use their pass to reserve the film for themselves. Thank you again, and hope to see everyone at another movie. Lehitraot, shalom, bye, thank you.